This presentation will introduce you to the qualitative research method known as narrative inquiry. We will outline key characteristics and assumptions of this method, provide a critique including its strengths and weaknesses, and finally provide an example of how the practice of narrative inquiry can be used to gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of the human experience. Making sense of experience through the practice of living out and sharing stories is thought to have existed since spoken communication. What is more recent, however, is the utilization of narrative methodologies in social science research. Narrative inquiry was initially used by Michael Connolly and Jean Clandillon to richly describe the personal experience of teachers and more thoroughly understand the meanings individuals create through shaping their own stories. Narrative inquiry is a qualitative methodology in which lived and told experiences are understood through recursive and reflexive storytelling or narratives. It presents a shift in the dynamic between the researcher and the participant, as inquiry is considered to be a much more collaborative process. Narrative inquiry represents a conceptual framework of understanding and inquiring that exists over time and within a unique social and spatial context. The process explores the intersection of three simultaneously occurring common places of experience: temporality, sociality, and place. Temporality refers to the time-based space, for example, the past, present, or future in which events are studied. It assumes the philosophical view that the experience of time is inherently narrative and can shift over time as well. Sociality includes the personal and social circumstances through which experiences and events unfold. The dimension of sociality is understood within the cultural, social, institutional, and lexical narratives. It is also important to consider that the inquirer or researcher also occupies a part of this domain. Place is defined as the actual space, the concrete and physical environment where an event or experience occurs. In this way, a researcher focused on narrative inquiry seeks to explore the tapestry of relational composition both inside and outside the person's lived experience.
Moving to key characteristics and assumptions. As a qualitative research method, narrative inquiry shares the key characteristics common to qualitative methods. So, for example, there is a focus on process, understanding, and meaning. The researcher is the chief instrument of data collection and analysis. It uses an inductive process and yields a richly descriptive product. The method tends to be emergent and flexible. Sample selection is purposeful and small, and the investigation normally takes place in the natural setting of the study, i.e. the field. In narrative inquiry, researchers study individuals' experience in the world. The method is inspired by and assumes a certain view of human experience. That is, that humans interpret and shape their lives through stories of who they and others are. It is through story that people make meaning of their experiences and make sense of their existence. The main version of narrative inquiry is storytelling by means of the researcher interviewing a participant. To the researcher, this is seen as both a process in which the narrator tells and a product, the story told. Some research focuses more on the stories told as the unit of analysis, while others give greater emphasis to the telling and the interpreted meanings made of the telling by the researcher. In addition to storytelling by interview, tellings may be obtained in other ways, such as through personal journals, photographs, and other first-person documents giving an account of some aspect of a participant's life. In addition to telling, narrative inquiry research can also be conducted by living. For example, a researcher may live the role of a teacher assistant, participating in classroom life alongside the teacher and students. Or another example might be a parent who chooses to conduct narrative inquiry research on their child. So, for example, if they had a preschool-aged child, they could take notes, noting the stories, narratives of their child. And in each of these cases, the field notes, the notes that the researchers take, form the basis for informing and enriching their understanding. In the this class, we have been learning about the different philosophies which underlie the various different research approaches and methods. And with respect to narrative inquiry, constructivism underlies this approach as it does other qualitative methods. And also the philosophy of hermeneutics, which is about interpreting texts from the perspective of their authors, i.e. written texts, which also includes interview transcripts. And also phenomenology, the study of experience from the subjective point of view. That's another philosophy that is said to inform this approach, this research method. Now, Taylor already spoke of how narrative inquiry's simultaneous exploration of the three commonplaces of experience, that's past, present, and future temporality, sociality, and place, how those are important in this method. And this is in fact key to this approach, and the simultaneous exploration of these three commonplaces are unique in this approach. Other methods may explore one or more of these approaches, but the purposeful and simultaneous exploration of all three is unique to this method. And further, the understanding of temporality is also a philosophical or ontological matter. Experiences are seen in continuous flow, always growing out of other experiences and leading to new ones. It's almost like narrative inquiries it's almost like they're Buddhists. Buddhists have this concept of impermanence. Everything is always shifting, always changing. This is a little bit similar. And to the researcher, it means just always a focus on the past, present, future in order to get a full picture and understanding of the participant's perspective. For the researcher, these three commonplaces are, in practice, all places to direct his or her attention in eliciting participants' stories. This intimate and very contextual study of individual stories can result in a deep understanding of participants' experiences and also new theoretical understandings.
The next two slides will be the strengths and uses of narrative inquiry, and it's under the header of critique of the method. This first slide speaks to qualitative research as well as narrative inquiry. So one of the strengths is that through narrative inquiry, we can learn from people's direct experiences, their expression of how they're feeling, and their hopes about the world in which we live. And it can inform the researcher as well as the participant. The second one is that it is useful for studying dynamic situations. And the dynamic in this instance could mean something like recognizing pattern or adapting to change or asking different questions based on the information we're receiving. It could also mean that the inquiry could unfold in a different way than expected. The third one is that it looks at local situations and conditions. And so that means it's looking at the particulars. In general, there wouldn't be trying to make grand statements or large overarching narratives, but it's more about looking at the lives of the people that the narrative inquiry is researching. So it looks to the particular. The next slide. So stories are at the core of narrative inquiry, and what this does is it helps to understand the complexities of human experience and the challenges of life events. These stories include that of the participants, the researcher, the story of the research itself, and the story of the final research when presented or published. So in this slide, it's broken down into three different areas of strength. One is for the research participants, one's for the researcher, and one's for the audience of the narrative inquiry. So for the research participants, voice. So participants have the opportunity to share their own experiences, knowledge, and voice. It's often an empowering experience for participants, and it also becomes part of the public record, with the possibility that their stories and experiences might inform policies that might be a benefit to them. It also is a way to challenge established ways of knowing and provide a space for voices that might not have been heard elsewhere. The next one is sharing. So the sharing again, it kind of is like voice, but it means that the participant themselves may be able to get some clarity or rethink their own story when they're sharing their experiences and understandings of the world, and have it become part of a new knowledge. For the researcher, there is a reflective aspect in narrative inquiry where the researcher's story becomes part of the research, in that a reflection has to occur. And hopefully within that reflection, the researcher would uncover maybe things that weren't visible to them prior, things like a bias or assumptions or being blind, having blind spots. And it also is a place where they too can show their care towards the participants. It's relational in that it's between people, and it's the interviewer and the interviewee, or the participant and the researcher. And also the researcher situates themselves within the research, often telling their story as part of the research. So they're within it as opposed to outside of it. For the audience of narrative inquiry, it can, what do I have here? Oh, it's relatable. So stories are familiar to most people, whether it's oral, written, and so for the audience of narrative inquiry, the stories can be compelling. It can also show depth, and by that it means it can help develop compassion or empathy for the participants, because they might have more nuanced positions, because the depth of understanding might show things like the relationships that the participant has or their cultural meanings. So having a narrative inquiry, you often get to the depth of things told from the point of view of the participant, and that can result in new knowledge being formed for the audience, the researcher, and for the participant themselves.
Next, we will be going over examples of what the research using narrative inquiry might look like. I will be going over 2 examples, and you will see that they are quite different. They're both research articles published in journals, but their format is very different. The first one is a traditional example. It consisted of interviews with 10 Fathers of Children with Special Needs. The format of this article is quite similar to a standard article you might find in a journal. It starts with an abstract, a literature review, then it describes the methods, the research design, the participants. It provides a table with demographic data. Then it moves into the analysis, which is the identification of themes. And then it goes into the findings where it further describes the themes and supports them with quotes from the interviews. And then in the discussion sections, the authors relate the themes to the literature on this topic. The reference is in the bottom right-hand corner if you're interested. This next example is also a journal article using narrative inquiry, but you'll see that the format is very different from the previous example. I would describe this as a more creative example. It highlights how narrative inquiry can be used to tell a story using a variety of different data, qualitative or narrative data. So in this case, the title of the article is Knitting Teacher, a narrative inquiry of a researcher who has been researched. And this teacher reflects on their experience teaching in the north of Canada as an individual with a European background. And similar to the title, the stories are also knitted. I shall say the stories, reflections, letters, and journal entries that were used were interwoven to highlight the themes that the researcher identified. And then at the end, this goes on for about 6 or 7 pages. And then at the end, there's a brief discussion with academic literature references. And it actually ends with questions for the reader, which is quite different from what I have previously seen in the research articles that I've read, but equally valid, peer-reviewed. Some other examples that you might find looking at narrative inquiry research articles are images, field notes, life experiences, and artifacts. In conclusion, narrative inquiry is appealing to many because humans are storytelling organisms who construct and reconstruct the world around them, making the study of story an ideal form of inquiry. Narrative inquiry provides the opportunity to capture nuanced perspectives, amplify stories often unheard, and lead to deeper insights with new theoretical understandings of people's diverse experiences.